Hello and welcome back to Neuro Narratives. On today's episode, we'll be talking about intergenerational trauma. And joined with me for that discussion, we have Jeffrey DeMarco. Jeffrey, hello.
Hello.
Jeffrey is the co-director for the Centre for Abuse, Trauma and Suicide Studies and a senior advisor with Save the Children and also a forensic psychologist.
Indeed.
I got that right, yeah?
You got it all right.
So, yeah, and also I wanted to say, just this week, Jeffrey, you delivered a really fascinating talk on the science of intergenerational trauma. And I can say firsthand, I was there. It was really fascinating, really informative, and I learned a lot from it. So well done and thank you. And we're very honoured to have you here in our podcast, continuing that conversation and discussion. And if I'm right in saying you've got another Seed Talks coming up, is that right?
That's right, Romy. And thanks so much for having me. It's fantastic to be here in Glasgow, and it's fantastic to get to see you 2 nights in a row.
Yep.
And indeed, in about a month's time, I will be back to talk about the science behind adverse childhood experiences.
Great. Okay. And that's in Glasgow as well, isn't it? Yeah, we're very lucky. Glasgow's lucky to have you. So I think before we get into any discussion today, given the nature of what we're going to be discussing, I think it's always good to have a kind of content warning and trigger warning. Obviously, the topics surrounding intergenerational trauma can be triggering and distressing for some viewers. And I would just urge, if you're listening to our episode, to kind of check in with yourself, where you're at just now. Does it feel like a good time to engage in this sort of content? And if not, then, pause, come back to us at another time. We're not going anywhere. Do you think that's fair to say? Yeah.
I think that is completely fair. It is a talk about trauma, so a bit of a trigger warning. We will be talking about trauma, but be compassionate with yourselves, be empathetic with yourselves, take a break, take care of yourselves, and don't feel like this isn't a safe space for you. But equally, I think it's really vitally important that people kind of approach this with, again, that level of compassion and empathy.
So, Jeffrey, the work that you do, intergenerational trauma, is obviously at the forefront, or trauma is at the forefront of what you do, your practice and your research. And that, obviously, that comes up in different systems and services that we come across, different organisations. And I suppose, I think where we should begin kind of our discussion today is thinking about what that means, because not everyone we come across will understand what intergenerational trauma is, or what trauma is, what it looks like, what it means. And I think a really good place to start would be for our viewers or for our listeners to think about what is intergenerational trauma, how do we define that, and why is it important? What is important about knowing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Romy, and it's often not necessarily viewed in the same way by everyone. And so it's really helpful to ground ourselves when we talk about what we mean by intergenerational trauma. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we refer to it as multi-generational trauma or transgenerational trauma. But the guiding principle here is that it's trauma that echoes across generations. It starts with what I like to refer to as an index trauma, or a structure or sequence of traumas that start said intergenerational processes, and it can have effects, different kind of effects on our biology, on our environment, on our attitudes, on our emotions, on our psychological well-being and our psychological distress, and it can be passed on by parents to their children, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about the biology. I think that's a really, really important point to make here. A lot of people assume that intergenerational trauma is this kind of passing on of genetic traits or changes in the DNA.
Yeah.
It's not quite the case, which we're going to get into throughout this discussion this evening. But it's really important that we understand, think of a pebble in a lake or in a little stream or a pond, right? There's a ripple effect. Intergenerational trauma doesn't work in a linear way. Mm-hmm. It kind of goes across the generations. You don't have to have directly experienced the index trauma or index circumstances to be affected by it, but also it affects us biologically, emotionally, psychologically, and there's a number of different things it can affect that will then continue that cycle.
Yeah, and when you say index population index event, what do you mean by that?
So when I use the term index trauma or index event or index traumas, if you will, what I'm trying to refer to is, from an empirical and scientific perspective, what started off the cascade of our view of the trauma. It won't always be easy to point and pinpoint.
Right.
lots of the work and lots of people assume that intergenerational trauma only comes with things like natural disasters, humanitarian crises, or wars. So in that situation, you can see kind of quite easily what we perceive the index trauma to be.
Yeah, sure.
But it's not that simple. Intergenerational trauma can be structural features and systemic issues like discrimination, racism, poverty. And it's really important that we remember that the stress, that cumulative chronic toxic stress that people experience based off of their identities, based off of who they are, that can start the process. It makes it a bit more difficult to then think of it as an index trauma.
Yeah, and it's like what you were saying there about the cumulative effect, which I really want to speak about, and I think it makes sense to talk about it here. The cumulative effect of adversity on an individual, and how you talk about that being so individual, and that being based on the conditions that person, that person's reality. And yeah, I guess that when we talk about the cumulative effect of stress or trauma or adversity, you said it there yourself, it's not always things like, although we have, and I know you try, avoid kind of that big T, small t trauma, and we can talk about that, sort of using that as a rhetoric in this sort of field and context. But I guess we think of things like natural disasters, like you said, war, famine, that's just to name a few, but as the sort of, and the kind of clear-cut trauma. But even with that, the cumulative effect, if we're talking about that as being a kind of index, experience, index event, even with that, the experience of the lived reality is so individual, isn't it? Like every person, even if they're experiencing that same situation, what they experience and how their brain experiences it and stores it and thus develops is so individual, isn't it? It's so unique.
It is. And I think that's really important, Romy, to talk about and for all of us to think about, especially if you're listening in for a variety of reasons, whether it's for your own lived experience or those of your loved ones, whether it's your professional, whether it's just pure curiosity, is let's try and move away from this kind of concept of small t and big T trauma. Let's legitimize the individual experiences of trauma, because there is no cookie cutter approach to trauma. And it's something I tell my postgraduate students when they start on learning about trauma impacts and interventions is there is no obvious response to trauma. There is no obvious manifestations of the symptoms of trauma. There's things we know psychologically, medically, through the research and work we've done. You take something like, post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that some of the symptomology involves nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, so on. These are things that are important to know. With major depressive disorder, we know that it's things like the feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, along with other bits. But it's important that it's the interpretation, it's the feelings, it's how it affects you. That is the trauma, how it affects you. But it also combines with other really important psychological concepts, like you said, adversity. So that's, again, thinking about how much adversity an individual's had to deal with over their lifetime. That could mean that an individual becomes more susceptible to future traumas. But it also could mean that they actually have built up a good threshold in tackling different traumas. There's a bi-directional effect to regular adversity. Vulnerability is also very different. It interacts hugely with our environment and our previous experiences. And then, of course, there's the concept of resilience, which can act as a protective factor and a safeguard. But resilience is something a little bit more complicated. And obviously, different people will build and curate and cultivate that in different ways. It's just really, really important to reflect that no two individuals are necessarily going to deal with traumas in the same way. It's quite normal for us as human beings to have a post-traumatic reaction to something that's quite traumatic. The problem is whether we have the skills and the capacities and the capabilities to actually not allow that to become something that is constant, that is chronic, that is toxic.
In my role as a psychologist, I'm very keen on not pathologizing what is, like you said yourself, a normal, if you can call it that, an adaptive, a reasonable and understandable response to a really, difficult situation, event. So I'm absolutely with that, with you on that. And the fact that there's, as well as with Epione, we're always trying to understand the context behind the behaviour and the wider context. And it's not as simple as, not even just as simple as biology or as simple as relationships or as simple as environment. It's a mix of these things, isn't it? It's a whole big kind of melting pot.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And you throw intergenerational trauma into that, right? So you might not have been born when the adversity and the challenges and the traumatic situations or events that affected your parents took place, but their ability to cope and adapt with said trauma may leave lasting impressions on you. But you make a really important point as well. It's not just about the biology. It's not just about the trauma. It's also about the social and environmental context. You know, we're living across a lot of the Western world right now in a cost of living crisis, which adds additional stressors in terms of accessing support, in terms of engaging in the things we like to do that could help us feel better, in terms of accessing services. So we need to be aware that actually one trauma in 1 year, on one day, in one family might not replicate in the same way in a year from then or 10 years from then in very similar circumstances. It's a lot to do about our biology, our environment, our previous experiences, and how we've been developed and how we've been supported.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Those structural kind of systems are so important. We can't forget them because there is a lot, like you said, there's a lot of conversation and discussion around the epigenetics and biological component. But that can feel very deterministic and fatalistic, can't it? So I think it's important to remember that, you know, there are other factors influencing it, which means there are other things that can support it.
I think if I may, there's a really important point there. This assumption that intergenerational trauma and trauma itself is just, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, biological, right? It's not. The trauma can be passed off through memories, through learning and hearing and observing and imitating. It could be the epigenetics themselves. It could have been, you know, our bodies, our brains are fantastic machines. It could be that in order for the parent or the individual or individuals experiencing the index trauma or events, they've had an epigenetic change, which is trying to improve their level of survivability. It's allowing them to adapt to extremely challenging and difficult circumstances. They then pass this epigenetic change on to their offspring, to their children or their grandchildren. Well, it might have a different effect on them. There will have been a change on top of the genes. The term epigenetics means on top of genes. But how it's activated, what it happens, a little bit like a dimmer switch is what I often like to refer to it as. For some people in some contexts, it might lower thresholds, it might lower expression. For others in other circumstances, it might heighten it.
And that could be for different gene expressions, can't it?
Correct. And it's really, really important. You know, there were some studies kind of on survivors of the Holocaust, and you know they noted epigenetic changes on something called FKBP5, which is a gene set for that helps regulate our stress response system. With the survivors themselves of concentration camps, and this is again in some of the studies that were done, there was an increase in what we refer to as methylation, so methyl groups on this gene, right? But then in their progeny, in their children, there was a decrease in that on the same gene. So we have to ask ourselves, why? What did the parents do? What happened to the parents so that they needed this increase for survivability? Do for the children that would assist them with their adaptability under challenging and difficult circumstances. But trauma can't predict the future. Trauma can't necessarily know that what they did for generation 1 is going to be useful for generation 2 in very different circumstances. Yeah,
and we see that even when the situation, the context has changed, that kind of imprint is still there. Yeah. So building on from our kind of understanding of intergenerational trauma, that was really thorough and comprehensive, and it helps set the foundation for our discussion. I want to think about applying this when we think about services, the services and organisations within society, within communities. So, of course, across services and systems, there are many people, service users, but also the people that work in these services, all living with their own experiences and potentially own adversities and own trauma. And of course, it's not always easy to identify when someone is dealing with adversity or has dealt with adversity and their behaviour is a response of that. So what I want to think about, or for us to think about and talk about, is generally, and not in a diagnostic sense, but generally what might professionals or people, just people, see or kind of be presented with when intergenerational trauma is present? What can that look like when we're thinking of being present in services? What can that show up like?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I know, I'm sure many of your listeners and all of us that work in the field talk a lot about what a trauma-informed approach looks like and whether or not we're appropriately using the term trauma-informed in a way that is meaningful, is helpful, and helps practitioners, people that support service users, clients in a way that is actually trauma-informed. I think for me, what trauma-informed is again, not necessarily pathologizing.
Yep.
But it's being aware that the way somebody's acting, the way they talk to you, the way they may be acting emotionally, the manner in which they might be with you in the there and now, doesn't necessarily mean. So I guess what I'm thinking here is somebody that shows up at a service as being aggressive, impulsive, jittery, numb, flat affect, it doesn't mean necessarily that they didn't do the work they needed to do, or it doesn't mean that they didn't engage in the tactics or the techniques that you had been talking about, or they hadn't reflected. It just means that because of the impact of intergenerational trauma on them, on their emotion, on their emotional regulation system, on their threat response system, on the manner in which, they might develop psychological distress and mental health difficulties, it means that the trauma is having an effect on them. I guess the only other thing I really want to say for me, and when working with services, is a key shift for me is it's not what is wrong with that person, but it's what has happened to this person, and thinking about, and what can we do to help them manage and cope with those feelings, with those thoughts, with those experiences.
Yeah.
And for me, that is being trauma informed. And you don't need to be a psychologist or a psychotherapist to do that. This kind of thinking applies to counselors, to teachers, to other mental health practitioners, those working in the criminal justice system. I'm not trying to make some of these financially strapped institutions be responsible for more, but I am trying to make sure that they are more trauma aware and they understand the multitude of ways that trauma can manifest, and that what they need to do is to not just make judgments and label when they see some of these things. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we say at Epione, is that trauma is everyone's business. It's all, I often speak about it with friends and family about, it's about, your supermarket worker needs to know about it, your taxi driver needs to know about it, and the person on the street that needs to know about it. We're all and we need to know about it. It's so important for us all to have an understanding, no matter who you are, where you come from, because we all at some point will experience adversity. We're not saying that it will, will cause trauma, but we will experience adversity, and we need the support from those around us. I want to go back to what you were saying when we were asking around what it can present like, and within services and organisations, what intergenerational trauma can present like. And I guess we talked there about trauma. I want to hone in on intergenerational trauma and the challenges that professionals might face on that specifically when that shows up. So how does that different when it's intergenerational trauma? What are the challenges there? Yeah, it's a good question. It will again very much depend on the context and what some of the index conditions, if you will, were. But I think a really helpful way of thinking about it is it can manifest again. It could be aggression, impulsivity, numbness, but it also could be a level of wariness or a lack of trust in professionals because of this breakdown of trust due to not having had previous generations be supported. And I think that's really important when we think about kind of some of the more systemic challenges in which conditions in which populations have been under. It's, thinking that the state, thinking that these professionals, these individuals that are more empowered than you. Think about it. If you're going to services for whatever it is, there is a power imbalance between the person that's seeking the support and the individual facilitator, counselor, mental health practitioner, whomever it might be. And if a power imbalance is part of their intergenerational trauma story, again, whether it was governments, whether it was conditions, whether it was poverty, whether it was kind of seen as quite structural, there is going to be a weariness. There is going to be a potential fear and reluctance to engage in a meaningful way. And it's up to the professionals to try and tackle that in a way that helps them engage and talk and think and get that person to engage in a way that is helpful for them.
Yeah, that makes so much sense when you frame it like that. I was like, whoa, because if the trauma has been around those kind of powerful systems, you know, if those powerful systems have been part of that trauma implementation, and then you go into a service and speak with someone where there is absolutely a power imbalance. I'm very aware of that myself as a psychologist every time I have a session, of the power imbalance that is present. And there's so many other things that lead into that as well. But if we're thinking about it in this context, then it makes so much sense that we could accidentally re-traumatize an individual, and how harmful that could be for not truly trauma informed and trauma aware. Again, just emphasizes the importance of learning, of conversations like this.
Absolutely, Romy. And there's an additional important thing that I've seen in some of the work I've done with kind of survivors and victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation, which is, if the practitioner cannot effectively create a therapeutic alliance. I use the term practitioner here lightly, because I'm not just referring to psychologists and the like. It could be a social worker, a youth worker. It could be, a mentor. It could be a coach. It could be people that are helping somebody in whichever way it works for that individual. If that power imbalance isn't acknowledged and lowered and minimized in a way that is meaningful to both parties, it, as you say correctly, can do a lot of damage. It can create further mistrust, but also it could give that individual a bad experience of the therapeutic relationship, which means they won't go back for support or help with another person because that individual has not created a safe condition, and that person now assumes that these other people that have the power, that might be there to support me, don't know what I've gone through, don't know how to help me. I'm just going to deal with it on my own. And that's scary for me.
Yeah, that is scary. That just shows you how easy it is for the walls to go up in the barrier. Understandably, the barrier that we face. So important. I want to ask around, so recently Epione have started working in Northern Ireland. So we've got associates over there who are delivering trauma-informed training across different organisations and different services like we're talking about. And some of our associates over there talk about trauma in the context of Northern Ireland, a place like that where they talk about sitting down daily with the echoes of trauma, of intergenerational trauma, the echoes in those conversations. And I want to focus on the word echoes because you talk about ripple effect, and I think they're similar. They're getting at similar things. So sitting with almost the ripple effect of what may have happened years ago, or what did happen years ago, and you obviously talk a lot about early intervention in your work. And I suppose my question in this is that what does early intervention look like in a situation, not just Northern Ireland, but if we think about in the context of trauma being, long-standing and almost normalised in community and society and in our way of being. It's normalised, it's maybe kind of overlooked. I don't know if that would be the correct term, but what does early intervention look like when trauma is almost part and parcel of the makeup of that society?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenge.
Yeah.
What does one do when cities, monuments, structures are all symbols of a shared significant set of traumas? It means constant reminders of said trauma. Hence the echoes left from previous conditions, previous situations are still a constant reminder. And there's also an element, I suppose, with this of where there's these conditions that have led to things in the past that are constantly reminded to people around silence. And what I mean by that is, if one is not in a situation or in conditions where there is a restorative, rehabilitative set of conditions that allow people to discuss how things made them feel, to discuss what it meant to them, discuss what it meant to their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and what it means to them and to their children and so on. So looking in both directions, that can be challenging. Now, I need to reframe this little, and then we'll come to your point on early intervention.
Yeah.
Talking about traumas, if done with the right conditions, can be good, can be cathartic, can provide shared narratives, can provide stories of shared adaptability, survivability, resilience. But under the right conditions and with the right motivations and with the right desires. Sometimes it's too hard for people, and I completely respect that, as should all of us, right? Sometimes it's too much and too hard to relive the trauma in those ways. And I guess you need to look at it a little bit of working with the person, right? As we talked about, there is no one cookie cutter approach or one size fits all trauma. There's no one size fits all to treatment and to kind of post-traumatic growth and creating your new narrative and whatnot after. Yeah. Now, in terms of early intervention, when it comes to something specifically like this, I think that we can take that public health approach, and we need to think about early awareness and knowledge for everyone. Mm-hmm. Now, that might sound a little bit scary and possibly even unethical. I'm not implying that we're talking about, sharing vivid descriptive details, but in age-appropriate ways within curricula, within families, within societies, communities, neighborhoods. And I say age-appropriate because that's quite important, right? It's, we need to talk to children about it at the right time when they're ready and they have the kind of capacities and faculties to kind of think and process about some of these things. But talking about it in the open can be quite helpful, because what that helps the younger generations do is to understand the difficulties and the traumas their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents went through, but it helps them look and reframe those traumas as signs of strength, as signs of perhaps what previous generations had to go through in order for them to have the opportunities and experiences that they now have.
Because you talk a lot about multi-agency collaboration, and I suppose you live that in your work. And how important would you say not only multi-agency collaboration, but kind of peer connection and peer support, which is a caveat there, because obviously, like you've just said, it needs to be delivered in a way that is safe, psychologically safe. Yeah. How important is that approach, and when we're thinking about supporting post-traumatic growth? Yeah,
no, it's vitally important. Listen, in the ideal world, we would have a very reintegrative, restorative, rehabilitative system that was able to give people that have experienced traumas, experienced intergenerational trauma, the right level of education, the right level of kind of skills training and apprenticeships, allow them to develop mastery and the skills they want, to feel motivated, to feel competent, to feel they have agency and all of that. So you'd have all of these people working with you. Let's be serious. Yeah. We live in a time in which services are strapped. A lot of the work that's done is about risk management and containment, as opposed to necessarily growth. But in an ideal world, it's making sure that the individual is assessed and engaged with in a manner in which we understand what their symptoms are, what their risks are. Yeah. We do our needs assessment on what we need to help them through, and then we look for responsivity on that. And you do that in whatever way works. You do that with a coach. Yeah. You do that with a therapist. You do that with somebody, an educator that's helping you kind of prepare for an exam or to write a CV or to do a budget. You do it with the people you need to do it. Connection is important. And I know that's not easy for everybody, especially those that have experienced significant traumas across several generations. Sometimes that might be the trigger. Connection might be the trigger. Yeah. And again, it needs to be when that person is ready and in a manner that works for them. I think the online space has made this slightly more accessible for a lot of people that might not have the confidence or the courage. Get rid of courage, please. Yeah, that's okay. Get rid of courage. That might not have the confidence to socially engage with others because, and part of that could be because of the type of trauma they went through, the cycles of abuse they've experienced, perhaps. And the online community does allow that. It does allow connection. It does allow accessibility. It provides a level of invisibility and anonymization, which is helpful for people to take some of those small steps. I am a big fan of peer support. So, working with others that have lived experience that you identify and see features with. If it's right for you, it won't be right for everybody, and that's completely fine. It's you that needs to be empowered. So it's about what you feel comfortable doing. Peer support, mind you, needs to be done in a semi-structured way and facilitated by those that understand the underpinning traumas and understand what post-traumatic growth is and what that needs to look like. Because if you just use peer support as a way for simple connection without some of those safeguards in place, there is a risk that actually it's not restorative. There is a risk that people end up kind of trying to trump each other with their lived experiences around, well, my trauma was worse than yours. And it's almost a gamification of trauma. And for me, that's not post-traumatic growth. That's not helpful in legitimizing somebody's trauma. Yeah. How would I feel if I joined a group of survivors of sexual violence or of terrorist attacks, and somebody tells me that, they lost more in their experience than I lost? It might actually make me feel like my trauma isn't worthy and I don't deserve help, and it's about me and I'm weak and I shouldn't be there. And
I think as well, there's already so much shame.
Correct.
Isn't there? Within trauma, there's already so much shame and guilt. And so that completely, exacerbates that feeling, or can completely exacerbate that emotion and feeling.
It's right. And so that's why peer support needs to be something that isn't laden with stress, isn't cognitively demanding. And I just, for the listenership, what I mean by cognitively demanding is I don't mean it to be like, you don't need to do much. It's just, it needs to be, again, facilitated, targeted, work on certain skills and competencies that aren't going to burden you when you already might be feeling that shame. And it also needs to encourage kind of growth of key developmental features. Like, we want to increase our self-esteem, our self-efficacy, our confidence, all of these things that give us a feeling of control back, that give us a sense of agency again. It's not going to cure everything, because there is no cure, right? It's about finding that narrative and integrating it into you whilst you engage in post-traumatic growth. So with peer support, again, I've seen brilliant examples of it with a lot of different service users in a lot of different settings with lots of different clients, but I've also seen it gone badly and poorly, in which it wouldn't have been helpful for the individuals that were going through it.
Yeah. And what we're talking about there makes me think, or what you were saying there makes me think of, we talk about the antidote of shame to be self-compassion, or even just compassion full stop. And and what that truly means. I could go on and on about compassion, but the importance of compassion is not kindness and warmth. It's courage, it's wisdom.
But it's also understanding and reflection. All of these normal things practice, which are so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that Epione are trying to do, that sort of fostering that reflective practice, and the importance of going into these different organisations and services and systems and areas to try and encourage reflective practice and encourage people to be, the more informed you can be, the more aware you can be of trauma, hopefully the better you can show up, and support, yourself, but also others and the others that you come into contact with in life. Yep. So as we come into the final part of our discussion, I want to widen the lens again. At Epione, we're passionate about that shift from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth, and what that means and looks like for people. And we want to focus on the capacity that humans do have for change and growth. We want to focus on and highlight that everything that we're talking about is not, like we said, it's not deterministic and fatalistic. I think that's really important, and I want to hear what you make of that and what that means when we say that it's not deterministic. Don't want to assume that people know what we mean when we say that. But actually we want to be able to focus on, the fact that our brains are malleable and able to change and adapt and kind of create new neural pathways and new narratives and new conditions. So that's what I would like to speak about. From your experience, what do you feel helps communities to move from kind of post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic growth? What do you feel helps make that shift?
Yeah, it's important to start with an understanding and an appreciation, again, that it won't be a one-size-fits-all, right? It's not going to, it'll be very different strokes for different people, and it will depend on their circumstances, it will depend on their support systems, it will depend on, again, their pre-existing adversities, their levels of resilience. And I'm going to come back to resilience in a moment. But for me, what helps communities shift, and we're talking about trauma from a community level perspective here, is, again, an ability for them to to create some kind of narrative for themselves, for their history, for their story, about what it is that they experienced, how they were able to survive what they experienced, look at the positives that have come out of that, and look at how that's created levels of strength and provided opportunity for the generations to come. So you look at examples in countries like Canada or Australia or in South Africa, where there have been kind of truth and reconciliation councils, for example, about some of the hardships of slavery, of apartheid, of how First Nations in Canada and Aboriginals in Australia were treated. And there's been some really good, outcomes out of those about, bringing communities together to understand what they went through, showing a willingness to engage and apologize, sharing what people had to do and how that demonstrated their grit, essentially, as opposed to just, like you were saying, the shame and the guilt that went around what they were subjected to. And this takes me to the point of resilience, right? Which is communities can have resilience, and resilience can cultivate the group's level of post-traumatic growth, of support. What's not helpful is just looking back and thinking that resilience only came out of the traumas. Resilience only developed as a consequence of what you experienced. It's looking more at perhaps how the trauma is able to allow you to adapt, to engage, to support yourself, to support others, to be there as a mentor, to be part of the mentee. Extremely important. Another bit I think that's really important, which kind of trickles out of the bit we discussed around peer support, is where we're talking about, again, systemic, community-wide, intergenerational trauma. What can the young people that perhaps weren't there when the conditions happened in the same way, what can they learn and what kind of relationships can they build with the older generations? We know that in general, intergenerational trauma work and research, that something that really helps is having one supportive adult in your life.
Yeah.
And that can be a parent or a carer, but it doesn't need to be. It could be a lot of different people. And I think with this, what we're talking specifically about an intergenerational, knowing an older member of the community that may have experienced conditions in a different way to you, building a bond with them in which you're able to reflect and to discuss in a meaningful way about what it felt like, what it did, and how that's impacted the way that you have been raised and been brought into the community and whatnot.
Yeah.
I think that can give the young people who are at the other end of the intergenerational trauma some really, really powerful information that they can weave into their own identities.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it's that. It's integrating that, if that's helpful for them, in a way that it's part of who they are, not just something in which they're labeled with.
Yeah, like you said, it's related to, trickles out of that peer support, the power and importance of people heal people, and it's relationships, that as much as relationships can create trauma, they also can create healing and growth. And I think that's really important. I know obviously the caveat which we mentioned is that sometimes that close connection may have been trauma.
Correct.
And we're understanding of that when we say that. But I suppose thinking more like longitudinal, we need relationships, as we're social beings, as humans, we are social beings and animals. And for new narratives and new conditions and new neural pathways to form that kind of positive relationships with just one other person. And I was trained as a child psychologist, so we talked about one good adult, but really it's just one good person, isn't it? Because we as adults still need that one good person. Correct. That we feel that trust and safety with, to be able to form those new neural pathways. And I want to just what I said there about trust and safety, because you mentioned trust and safety earlier, and when someone's trust is impacted, which 9 times out of 10 it will be, their trust will have been impacted either directly or indirectly. And I want to think about how we help to build trust and say a sense of safety when working. So following on from what we've just said there, how do we, as practitioners, but again using that general kind of, or meaning that in a general sense, how do we as people, as practitioners, help to build that sense of safety and trust? How do we start to build that? What kind of structures or factors help with that?
Being consistent. So whether you are a practitioner or not, whether you're a mentor, whether you're a neighbor that always checks in, again, it's being consistent. That helps reinforce a certain level of certainty, certain level of confidence in the individual that may be struggling. So you become kind of this oasis or symbol of certainty. So important. If we think about people that are experiencing traumatic symptomology, often they'll have challenges with their stress response systems. They're always on guard. They're always being vigilant about where the next threat is.
Yeah.
And for anybody that knows what it's like to worry, just imagine that all the time, nonstop. It's constantly being on your toes to think about where the next threat may be coming.
Yeah.
If we as practitioners, or again, other adults in the community who are that safe relationship, if we can be consistent with them, then that allows them to at least have certain situations across their day, across their week, across their month, where they know their body learns that the system doesn't need to be on high alert.
Yeah.
And then with that, and again, it will depend on the field that the individual is working in and who this trusted adult is. It's always about what can we do to make that individual enjoy something? What can we do to make them feel a sense of mastery? A sense of skills. It doesn't need to be being the next best rugby player or footballer on the pitch, but it needs to be doing something they enjoy, again, within realistic boundaries, and that allows them to essentially drift away from their traumas. Drift is a little bit disingenuous. It's not that they're forgetting, it's not that we're neglecting, but it's about their empowerment. So coupling that consistency with, again, this thing of helping them curate and develop those talents, those skills, whatever it is. It might be learning to read French. It might be learning how to get a really high score on Tetris. I mean, it could literally be anything if the person gets satisfaction out of it. And I think the last bit is needing to be attuned with your own or our own emotions. And, we started this entire kind of chat today around the importance of empathy and compassion. We are all human. We will all have good days and bad days. But understanding that when you're working or being that person for that supportive, trusted adult for somebody else, it's making sure that you are able to disassociate kind of your own challenges and to still be there for them in a way that's useful, helpful, and meaningful.
When we were talking about trust there and consistency being a kind of factor in supporting building trust and sense of safety, it reminds me of the kind of guiding principles of trauma-informed practice of sort of choice, safety, control, trust. What's the other one? Empowerment. There we go.
Well done.
So yeah, all those things being so important for in supporting that sense of safety and trust. And it reminds me of something you said at your talk around kind of structures and routines, and actually. But then I'm thinking of what we've learned today, and actually that structures and routine, there's no cookie cutter approach, because structures and routines could be someone's form of trauma, could be the trauma that they experience, could be in rigidity around structures and routines. So it's about working with the person, being adaptive to them and whatever they're bringing, however they show up. We talk about meet someone where they're at. In psychology, you'd say you meet someone where they're at. And this is what that means. This is proof of what that means, what we're talking about.
I think that's spot on. And I think it's, again, we have to, with all of this, we have to take firstly, we need to take a biopsychosocial, approach. It's not, like we said at the very beginning, not just the biology, not just the psychology, not just the environment. It's an interaction and a combination of all of these things within the socio-historical context that you're in. It's about accessibility to support. It'd be so inappropriate for us to say everybody should just go and get a great therapist right now, because not everybody can go and get a great therapist. Not everybody wants to. Not everyone's motivated to. And there's a bit of a postcode lottery he says. There is, in which it will be more easier for some and not necessarily for others. And your point around meeting people where they are, it's so important. The support we can give somebody might literally just be going for a walk in silence with them, right? It might be going and sitting and having a pizza with them. It might be talking about their feelings. It could be so many different things. And if we just try and force certain structures onto people that aren't willing to talk about certain parts of it, that aren't willing to deal with other parts of it, in which there's TIBs, so treatment interfering behaviors. So it could be everything could go well, but there's one thing that is causing them not to engage properly. But if I engage with that, that could be re-traumatizing for them. So it's figuring out little nuggets like that. And that can be super difficult. How do you treat somebody when there's perhaps that's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or a major depressive disorder, when actually they have a serious substance abuse challenge. And so whenever they come, they're under the influence. Well, you can't engage in meaningful support that way until you treat the first symptom. So it's that bespoke. Bespoke is the word we're looking for. And again, in an imaginary world, we'd have the funding, the services, the finances in which everybody could get that bespoke service. In that we go back to the empowerment element, I suppose, of being trauma-informed. What can we do to empower people? And I do come back to my point around giving them structure. That's that routines, that consistency, so that they can at least have a reprieve from what they're feeling, but also trying to find something and a passion they like.
How does that, so that predictability, how would you say that, how in terms of the neuroscience, what does that do to the brain, that predictability, that consistency and structure and routine? What does it do to the brain?
It's anticipatory behavior in theory as linked to that, knowing what's coming, knowing there will be a safe time. And I'm not saying it's super safe in the sense of they're still struggling, they're still sad, they're still feeling some of the things they're feeling. But that knowledge allows their body to essentially go off guard. So if we think about our stress response system and the HPA axis and cortisol flowing around, with time, that person might not need to be on high edge because they go, this is where I'm going to see this person, or this is where I'm going to do this activity. Their body will learn to tone down, and that then will give their heart, give their brain, give their hormones, give everything a break. And that then gives them a certain level of consistency. That gives them a level of predictability. That means that, they can feel safe. So I've seen this a lot with kind of groups we've worked with, where simple things like sticking to regular meal times, getting up at the same time and going to sleep at the same time, going back to school or to work or university after you've experienced some traumas, when you're ready, even if you're still sad, even if you're still dealing with the challenges and the consequences, that routine and structure just lets the body shift in lower gear for at least a small amount of time each day, each week.
It's the importance of, I suppose, lowering that stress response. And you talked about hypervigilance earlier. It's almost like being in high alert. We talk about trauma and that hypervigilance, high alert, being in constant state of fight, flight, freeze, understandably, because it was useful and the adaptation was to be supportive, but now it's no longer serving that person. It's actually now harmful. So it's really important points that you make there. I want to bring us to our final question. Jeffrey, if you could offer one message of hope to anyone who's listening, anyone who's tuning in, who feels shaped by their past, whatever that looks like for them, what would that message be? What would that sound like?
Romy, I think I would say that trauma can shape us. Intergenerational trauma can shape us, but it does not need to define us. We've said a few times that intergenerational trauma is not fatalistic, is not deterministic. It's probabilistic. It is a series of events, factors, features that when they come together, they could increase the likelihood of experiencing negative symptomology, but they won't always, and they don't need to. However, if we really want to be hopeful with all of this, and we really want to kind of be like, across these generations, this is quite difficult. Trauma can echo across the generations. That fear, that shame, that pain, it can all stay with us, and it can be passed on, again, through the neurobiology, through the conditioning, through the memories and the shared narratives. But you know what else can be passed along is the courage, is the strength, is the versatility, is the resilience. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that these things that happen are our body's ways of responding to keep us safe. And so it's doing a good thing. Let's reframe that conversation, and let's agree that talking to an extent about intergenerational trauma is helpful because it helps make us as a community less stigmatizing about general mental health difficulties and psychological distress, and more about taking care of ourselves and taking care of our loved ones and taking care of our communities.
Jeffrey, thank you once again for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us today. We're very honoured to have you on here on Epione's podcast. And with that, that's us complete. If you're listening at home and you're interested in hearing more about Epione and what Epione does, you can find us at epionetraining.com or on LinkedIn, Epione Training and Consultancy. And Jeffrey, people can find you on LinkedIn.
That would be perfect. Please do reach out. Always happy to talk and to connect.
Lovely. Jeffrey DeMarco. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.